Welcome to Revenge Oath. Tonight we travel aboard the legendary Orient Express, where luxury and deception ride side by side. A passenger lies dead, the doors locked, the suspects many. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, from where are you listening? Reading your thoughts always brings me joy. Stay with me until the end. This case will show that even perfection in planning cannot outwit Poirot's little grey cells. Chapter number 1. Shadows on the Orient Express. The night was dense with fog, an ethereal blanket that clung to the tracks of the great railway line as the Orient Express steamed its way from Istanbul to Calais. Inside the opulent, polished carriages, the warmth of thick velvet curtains and the hum of the brass lamps created an atmosphere that was at once soothing and insistent. The clinking of crystal and soft laughter echoed from the dining car, where the wealthy and the curious indulged in their lavish meal, as though the world outside could not touch them. But in the midst of this rarefied luxury, beneath the elegant conversation and the faint scent of imported perfumes, something sinister stirred. The train, a mechanical marvel, was steadily heading towards an unknown fate. At precisely 11:45 p.m., the stillness of the train was shattered. A sharp cry rang through the night. A woman's scream, hysterical, strangled with terror. It tore through the velvet night and clattered across the gleaming carriages, causing passengers to freeze in mid-conversation. A young maid, pale as the moonlight filtering through the windows, rushed into the dining car. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, her breath short, her hands trembling. It's terrible. A murder has occurred." Hercule Poirot, who had been enjoying a quiet after-dinner moment in his compartment, stepped into the corridor with an elegant calm. His small but sharp figure, framed by his perfectly tailored suit and immaculately curled mustache, exuded a confidence that was almost unnatural in its tranquility. He was not just any detective. He was a man of exceptional intellect, the kind of person who could solve mysteries while others were still muddling over the facts. "Calm yourself, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently but firmly, his French-accented voice cutting through the growing panic. "Tell me, what is this about?" She glanced at him with wide, frightened eyes. "A man. He's dead, Monsieur Poirot. In his compartment. The door was locked from the inside, and no one can understand it. Please, you must come." Without a word, Poirot followed her through the narrow hallways of the train. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal and the faint mustiness of the old wood. As they arrived at the compartment, the door was already ajar. Poirot stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was enough to make even the seasoned detective pause for a fraction of a moment. A man in his mid-40s lay sprawled across the luxurious carpeting, his lifeless body at an odd angle. His face was frozen in an expression of shock, as though something had startled him just before death had claimed him. His impeccably tailored suit, once pristine, was now rumpled and stained with dark patches of blood. Poirot knelt by the body, carefully inspecting the victim's features. The man's eyes were wide open, fixed on something beyond the window, something unseen by the other passengers, but clear in the mind of the great detective. The strange angle of his body suggested no struggle, no frantic escape. It was as if he had simply slumped, resigned to his fate. But there was no sign of a weapon, and no apparent cause of death. The locked door offered no clues either. How had this murder occurred, and who could have committed such an act aboard a moving train? Poirot stood up, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. His mind, sharp and methodical, immediately began to sift through the possibilities. The victim's identity would need to be confirmed, of course, and the train staff must be questioned, but there were already questions swirling in his mind. As he turned to leave the compartment, the maid, still standing in the corridor, appeared on the verge of tears. "Please, Monsieur Poirot, tell us it is not true. What does this mean?" With a look of silent assurance, Poirot met her eyes, his voice calm and unwavering. "It means, mademoiselle, that we are about to embark upon a very difficult journey indeed." But rest assured, for where others see only confusion and chaos, Hercule Poirot sees only the clear trail of logic. He gave the maid a polite nod and made his way to the dining car. The passengers had gathered, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, but no one dared to speak, as though words themselves might worsen the situation. Poirot's eyes scanned the room, assessing each of them with a quick, calculating glance. "Now," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "let us begin. There is much to be done, and this mystery will not solve itself. I suggest we all remain calm and allow me to do what I do best." His small but piercing gaze fell upon each individual. Poirot's mind was already working, weaving through the web of possibility, analyzing the faintest clue. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until the truth was revealed. Chapter number 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The Orient Express had become an unintentional theater of the absurd. What was once a symbol of luxury and exclusivity now felt like a pressure cooker, its passengers trapped inside with no escape from the deadly mystery that had unfolded within the confines of their gleaming carriage. Poirot, having instructed the train staff to isolate the compartment and prevent anyone from entering, now stood in the dining car, facing the passengers. The somber atmosphere weighed heavily on the room, but Poirot's steady gaze held it in check, forcing everyone to listen, to remain still. In his mind, the questions were already taking shape. How had the murderer gained access to the compartment? Why was the victim murdered in such a locked and controlled environment? And most crucially, who among these passengers had the most to gain from his death? With a calmness that belied the tension in the air, Poirot addressed the group. "You are all, I believe, acquainted with one another, yes?" He let his question hang for a moment, his eyes moving slowly across the group, studying their reactions. There were 12 passengers in total, and each one looked as though they had been physically or mentally caught off guard by the crime. At the front of the room, an elegantly dressed woman in her 30s, her dark hair pinned in a tasteful knot, stood close to her husband, a tall, distinguished gentleman with a military air about him. Her name was Lady Clarissa Ashford, and she appeared to be in a state of shock, her fingers absently tugging at the lace trim of her sleeve. Beside them stood a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, with striking features and an air of quiet intensity. His name was Geoffrey Sterling, a businessman with a reputation for ruthlessness in the boardrooms of London, though he kept his emotions well hidden under his carefully cultivated exterior. Poirot's gaze then moved to a couple who sat near the rear of the car. The woman was a striking beauty with blonde hair and a radiant smile, but her face betrayed a certain wariness, as though she had been caught in a lie. Her husband, a thin, sharp-featured man named Dr. Julian Firth, appeared outwardly calm, though his nervous twitching at his collar suggested otherwise. Poirot's eyes lingered on the elderly man sitting alone by the window, his face lined with age and his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his walking stick. This was Monsieur Gaston Dupré, a retired diplomat from France who had fallen out of favor with some of his former colleagues. He had been unusually quiet since the discovery of the body, as if he were attempting to avoid notice. As Poirot continued to observe, his attention shifted to a woman dressed in the deep green of a governess, her face lined with worry. Miss Eliza Worthington, a schoolteacher traveling to Paris, was glancing nervously between her fellow passengers. She seemed ill at ease with the gathering crowd, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if to prevent them from betraying her anxiety. Poirot's sharp eyes then turned to the next figure, a tall man with a heavily ink-stained collar and unkempt hair. He was Charles Worthington, a journalist whose name had appeared in the papers several times in connection with scandalous exposés. Though his eyes were fixed ahead, he seemed to be staring straight through the scene in front of him as though consumed by an internal dialogue. Poirot's mind catalogued each face, each personality. In moments like this, It was not enough to simply gather facts. One needed to understand the people behind them. "Now, my friends," Poirot began, his voice firm yet pleasant, "it is my task to uncover the truth of this terrible event. We must begin with the facts at hand, but also with the understanding that some of you may have secrets." The word hung in the air like a challenge, and the room fell quiet. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if daring someone to speak up. Lady Clarissa, her composure now visibly faltering, was the first to break the silence. I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding," she stammered. "But the man, he was just sitting there. I've never seen him before in my life." "Ah, but madame," Poirot replied, turning to her with a quiet intensity, "you are mistaken in one thing. You have seen him before, in fact, and it is vital that you recall exactly where and when." Her expression shifted, panic flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes narrowing. "Do not worry, madame. This is a mystery that will unfold, but only if you help me. And you, all of you, must help me." As the room fell back into an uneasy silence, Poirot turned his attention to Geoffrey Sterling, whose posture had stiffened. "And you, Monsieur Sterling," Poirot said, his voice soft yet commanding, "you seem to have some knowledge of this misunderstanding." Sterling shot him a wary glance, but said nothing. Poirot could tell there was something off about his reaction, something deliberate. "I will speak to each of you in turn," Poirot continued, "and I will ask you to be truthful. Not for me, but for yourself. A lie will only make the truth more difficult to find. Remember this." Poirot's sharp mind was already working, piecing together his first impressions. The locked door, the lack of struggle, the calmness of the passengers, the uneasy silence when he had entered the dining car. They were all connected, tightly, woven together in ways no one in the room yet understood. The game had only just begun, and Hercule Poirot was already several moves ahead. Chapter number 3. The initial interviews. The dining car remained unusually still, the usual hum of conversation now replaced by a low, almost palpable tension. Each of the passengers sat in quiet anticipation, their faces a mixture of unease, confusion, and fear. Hercule Poirot, standing at the center of the room, his sharp eyes moving over each of them, seemed entirely unaffected by the atmosphere. He had long learned to exist in the thick of such unease, able to discern the truth not from what was spoken, but from what remained unspoken. "Let us begin," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm, an unmistakable command in the way he held the room. "I will speak with each of you individually. We shall start with you, Monsieur Sterling." Geoffrey Sterling, who had been sitting with his hands folded on the table, now straightened his back. His face betrayed little emotion, though there was a hint of wariness behind his carefully controlled exterior. As Poirot gestured for him to follow, the man stood, adjusting his cuffs before walking towards a quiet corner of the car. Poirot's eyes never left him as the two men moved. "Monsieur Sterling," Poirot began once they were alone, "tell me, how did you first come to be acquainted with the deceased?" Sterling's lips tightened for a moment, then he spoke. "I have no idea who he was. Not a single clue. I was simply in my compartment when the scream interrupted my reading. The maid came and I followed her, just as everyone else did." Poirot studied him for a moment, noting his sharp eyes, which flickered briefly towards the door as though he were expecting something or someone to enter. "You do not look entirely convinced, Monsieur Sterling," Poirot remarked, his tone gentle but pointed. "Are you sure you did not know him, this man? Perhaps, if not directly, you may have seen him at some earlier occasion." Sterling hesitated. "I don't," he faltered, then steadied himself. "No, I've never seen him. That's the truth. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more. He was not one to rely on the first answer. Often, the truth was buried beneath layers of hesitation, and it was in those moments of delay where he would strike. "You are a man of business, I understand?" Poirot continued, his voice polite, measured. "Have you been traveling for any particular reason?" Sterling shifted, his discomfort growing. "I'm on a business trip. That's all. No need to make anything more of it." Poirot studied him for a long moment, then turned his attention to the man's hands, still folded neatly in front of him, but his fingers were twitching now. A nervous tell. It was small, but Poirot had long ago learned to trust such subtleties. "I see," Poirot replied, a slight smile curling his lips. "Thank you, Monsieur Sterling. You may return to your seat now." Sterling hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his features, but he nodded stiffly and returned to his place, sitting down and pretending to be absorbed in his thoughts. Poirot turned back to the rest of the room. His gaze swept over the remaining passengers, his mind calculating the next steps. The next to be questioned was Lady Clarissa Ashford, whose poised beauty seemed to have weathered the initial shock better than others. She rose slowly, following Poirot to a quieter corner. "Lady Ashford," Poirot began with a bow, "I must ask you the same question. How did you come to be involved in this unfortunate event?" The woman's voice was soft, trembling only slightly as she spoke. I was in my compartment when I heard the scream. My husband and I—" She hesitated and glanced at her husband, who was seated at the table watching them carefully. "We went to see what had happened. And when we found out, we couldn't believe it. And this man," Poirot continued, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You have never seen him before?" "No," Lady Ashford replied quickly, almost too quickly. "I don't think so." "I certainly never spoke to him." I would have remembered Poirot studied her for a moment, noticing the way she avoided looking directly at him, as though something within her was at war with the outward calm she displayed. He could feel the pressure building, the sense that she was hiding something small, perhaps insignificant in her mind, but essential to the unraveling of the mystery. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "I believe that you do know this man, but perhaps not in the way you believe. Tell me, when was the last time you saw someone whom you trusted, who could speak of a secret?" She flinched. The sharpness of Poirot's words seemed to take her off guard, and her face paled. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot held up a hand to stop her. "No need to explain now. I shall give you time. But remember, the truth is often hidden in places we least expect." Lady Ashford looked as if she might argue, but instead she fell silent. With an uneasy glance at her husband, she retreated to her seat, her mind clearly elsewhere. Poirot returned to the center of the room. The suspects were beginning to grow uneasy, each eyeing one another, their quiet glances suggesting they were starting to realize that the detective's scrutiny would not let them rest. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Dr. Julian Firth. The man seemed to have recovered from the initial shock, though his eyes held a flicker of something more, perhaps guilt or fear. Poirot gestured for him to join him, and Firth complied, his steps measured. "Doctor," Poirot began, his tone still polite, but now tinged with a hint of force. "Perhaps you can explain to me the nature of your relationship with the deceased. I understand that you, like others, were shocked by the event. But perhaps you knew him." Dr. Firth's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice smooth. "No, I did not know him. I'm a man of science, not in the circles where such people travel. I'm here on personal business, as I've explained to the others." "And what business is that?" Poirot pressed, noting the way Firth's hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. "Nothing of importance," Firth said curtly. "Just a small matter, a personal matter." As I said, Poirot made no further comment, but his mind was already racing. Firth's nervousness, his tight-lipped responses, it all pointed to something beneath the surface, something more than the doctor was willing to admit. As Firth returned to his seat, Poirot's mind continued to churn. The pieces were beginning to form, but they were far from complete. The next interview would be even more revealing. Chapter number 4. The First False Lead. The Orient Express continued its journey, the rhythmic chugging of the train now a mere backdrop to the mounting tension that had settled over the passengers. Hercule Poirot moved through the cars with quiet assurance, his mind relentlessly piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Each of his conversations with the passengers had brought him closer to the truth, yet at the same time it had obscured his vision further. Everyone had a secret, but which one was worth unmasking? As the night pressed on, Poirot decided it was time for the authorities to be alerted. The train's conductor, an imposing man named Monsieur Lemoine, was informed of the crime and arrived in the dining car with a grim expression. Poirot, ever the tactician, had requested a private word with him. "Conductor, I must ask you to arrange for the police to meet us when we arrive in Calais," Poirot said calmly, his eyes still studying the faces around him. "But until then, we must proceed as though the solution is already within our reach." Monsieur Lemoine looked at Poirot, bewildered. "But surely, Monsieur Poirot, we have no way of knowing what happened." "We cannot take matters into our own hands." Poirot's gaze softened for a moment, a hint of a smile curling at the edges of his lips. "You see, my friend, that is where we differ. I always know what has happened. It is only a matter of how the puzzle pieces fall." After a moment of thought, Monsieur Lemoine gave a reluctant nod, albeit still unsure of how to proceed. Poirot turned away from him, already focused on the task at hand. The train continued on, but as Poirot made his way back to the passengers, something unexpected occurred. Lady Clarissa Ashford, the woman who had been so composed earlier, was now standing in the middle of the dining car, her face pale and trembling. She had a letter in her hand, clutched tightly as though it were the only thing tethering her to reality. She approached Poirot with an urgent air. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I think I know who did it. It was Geoffrey Sterling. I saw him in the corridor last night. I know what I saw." Poirot's eyebrows raised slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Lady Ashford, you are certain of this?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "You saw him with your own eyes?" "This Geoffrey Sterling?" "Yes, I was in my compartment, and I heard footsteps outside my door. I thought nothing of it at first, but then I saw his figure in the shadows, standing still as though waiting. And then, the scream." She swallowed hard. "I'm sure it was him." Poirot studied her carefully, noting the slight quiver in her voice, the trembling of her hand as she held out the letter. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the desperation. Was she telling the truth, or was this merely a desperate attempt to divert suspicion from herself? "Monsieur Poirot," she continued, pressing the letter into his hand. "This letter, when I found it, I couldn't ignore what it meant. It's addressed to the victim. It must be the key." Poirot glanced at the envelope, noticing that it was indeed addressed to the deceased, though the handwriting was unrecognizable to him. He carefully opened the letter, his trained eyes scanning the contents. The message was brief, hastily written in a scrawl that only further piqued his interest. "Meet me tonight in the compartment. We must speak of what's coming. Do not involve anyone else." A strange sensation stirred within Poirot's chest. This could be the breakthrough. The letter could explain everything. It was a direct communication between the victim and one of the passengers, and yet the contents gave little indication of who the writer was. Poirot folded the letter carefully, his expression unreadable. "Lady Ashford, this is indeed important, but I must ask you, why did you not come forward with this sooner?" Lady Ashford bit her lip, the color draining from her face. I I wasn't sure what to make of it. I didn't want to cause more trouble than necessary. And now I'm certain he's the one who did it." Poirot said nothing for a moment, his mind swirling with the possibilities. Could Lady Ashford have been the one to write the letter? Was she fabricating a story to shift suspicion onto Geoffrey Sterling? Or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? The idea that Lady Ashford might have been involved began to take root in Poirot's mind. She had the means, the motive. But then again, there were others who could just as easily fit the bill. Sterling's behavior, Firth's nervy responses. It was too soon to draw conclusions. "Lady Ashford," Poirot said quietly, placing the letter into his pocket, "you have provided me with something valuable. But I must caution you, do not jump to conclusions so hastily. A mind like mine, however small, must remain open." With that, Poirot turned away and made his way to the next passenger. Later that evening, after conducting his rounds of questioning, Poirot returned to his compartment to gather his thoughts. The false lead that had been presented by Lady Ashford was already swirling in his mind, but it wasn't enough to conclude anything. A careful observer, he knew, could easily fabricate such a tale. Yet the letter was real. He could not dismiss that fact. Perhaps it was a mistake to dismiss her claim so readily. As the train wound its way toward Calais, Poirot pondered the various possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was much closer than he had initially thought. The passengers were hiding something, and the truth lay buried beneath layers of deception. But he could wait. His little grey cells would uncover it, bit by bit. Chapter number 5. Another crime or major reveal. The evening wore on as the Orient Express glided through the darkened countryside, its wheels clicking steadily against the rails, the rhythmic sound a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts in Hercule Poirot's mind. Each passenger had been questioned, each of their words carefully catalogued, but the threads of the mystery remained stubbornly tangled. Poirot had just settled into a chair in his compartment, the train dimly lit by a solitary lamp, when there came a sudden, frantic knock at the door. The sound sliced through the calm like a blade. Poirot's brow furrowed, his mind racing to align the disturbance with the peculiar events of the night. "Come in," Poirot called calmly, but with an edge of authority that brooked no hesitation. The door opened quickly, revealing the frazzled figure of Monsieur Lemoine, the train conductor. His normally composed demeanor was now replaced by visible distress, his face pale beneath the weight of an undeniable fear. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "Something has happened, something terrible. You must come quickly. It's Miss Worthington. She's gone. Missing." Poirot stood, his sharp mind already pivoting toward the implications of this new revelation. His eyes met Lemoine's, and for a moment the two men shared a wordless understanding. The stakes of the game had just escalated. "I shall come at once," Poirot replied, straightening his jacket as he moved toward the door. "Lead the way, monsieur." As they made their way down the narrow corridor, Poirot's thoughts churned. Miss Eliza Worthington had been quiet during her interview, but there had been a faint sense of unease about her, an anxiety that she had done her best to mask. Could her disappearance be linked to the murder? Or was there something else at play? The train was eerily quiet as they passed through the dimly lit compartments. The passengers had retired to their rooms, perhaps still reeling from the shock of the previous discovery. But now, another layer of the mystery had been added, and Poirot felt a deep sense of foreboding as they approached Miss Worthington's compartment. Lemoine knocked once, then opened the door. Poirot stepped inside. The compartment was untouched, at least at first glance. Miss Worthington's belongings were neatly arranged, her bed still undisturbed, but there was something unmistakable about the air in the room. It felt wrong. It was as though something vital had been ripped out of this small space, leaving only a hollow trace behind. "There is no sign of her, Monsieur Poirot," Lemoine said, his voice strained. "I've checked every other compartment." "She isn't anywhere." Poirot stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the room with surgical precision. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no disarray. But Poirot wasn't looking for chaos. His mind worked differently. He searched for patterns, for the subtleties of human action that others might overlook. His eyes fell on a small piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the edge of the bed. It was a letter, folded and crumpled slightly, as though hastily discarded. Poirot bent to pick it up, his fingers brushing the surface. He opened it carefully. It was addressed to no one in particular, but the contents of the note sent a chill through his veins. "I have seen enough. It's all too dangerous now. The truth is within my reach, but I am not sure I can protect myself any longer. Meet me by the rear carriage door at midnight. I'll have the answers." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The handwriting was familiar, but it took him only a second to recognize it as Miss Worthington's. So she knew something. She had known more than anyone had suspected, and now she was gone. The disappearance of Miss Worthington added an entirely new dimension to the mystery. Someone had clearly wanted her silent. Had she discovered something that the killer feared would expose them? Or was it possible that her disappearance was just another layer of misdirection? Poirot straightened up, looking around the compartment once more. Nothing about the scene was entirely straightforward. The note, though indicative of some sort of plot, raised further questions. What was Miss Worthington truly after? And who had she trusted enough to meet at midnight? "Monsieur Poirot," Lemoine interrupted his thoughts, "what should we do?" This is becoming more dangerous by the minute. Poirot's gaze flickered back to Lemoine. "We shall continue as we have been, my friend," he replied. "We keep our wits sharp and observe everything. Miss Worthington may have been trying to solve the puzzle herself, or perhaps she was trying to warn us. But we shall not rush to conclusions." Poirot turned toward the door, his mind already calculating the next course of action. "There is still one thing we must consider, Monsieur Lemoine. Who benefits from Miss Worthington's disappearance? Who stands to gain the most from keeping the truth hidden?" Lemoine's face contorted in thought. "You think someone took her because she was getting too close to the truth?" "I do not think," Poirot corrected him. "I know. Someone in this train is trying to control the narrative, and they will stop at nothing to ensure that their secrets remain buried." Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "We are all just pawns in a game far larger than we realize, but soon I will have the answer. Soon the truth will reveal itself, and the murderer will make one fatal mistake." With Poirot's mind racing toward the next step, the tension in the air grew. He knew this mystery was no longer simply about a murder. It was about the power of deception, the manipulation of truth, and the lengths to which someone would go to keep their hidden life from being exposed. But the game was far from over. Poirot's next move would be decisive. Chapter number 6. Poirot's hidden clue. The Orient Express continued its relentless journey through the night, cutting through the cold darkness of the European countryside, as Hercule Poirot sat in his compartment, his mind spinning with the developments of the evening. Miss Worthington had vanished, and her disappearance, so sudden and so carefully planned, had only deepened the mystery. She had been on the verge of uncovering something crucial, but now she was gone, leaving only her cryptic note and a trail of unanswered questions. Poirot knew he had to act quickly. The clock was ticking, and he could feel the invisible threads of the case pulling him closer to a final confrontation. He had already seen the first signs of a pattern, a psychological game being played by someone aboard the train, but now there was a more immediate problem. Miss Worthington's absence had forced him to consider new possibilities. He needed to speak with the remaining passengers, to confront them, to push them just enough to make them reveal the truth. It was time to stop waiting for the pieces to fall into place and start assembling them himself. Poirot stepped out of his compartment, the cool air of the corridor, a welcome change from the suffocating tension of his thoughts. He made his way down the narrow hall, stopping briefly to glance into each compartment. The passengers were restless, uneasy, their eyes darting nervously whenever they met his gaze. As Poirot approached the dining car, he found Lady Ashford, Geoffrey Sterling, and Dr. Firth standing in a tight circle, speaking in hushed tones. The moment they noticed Poirot, they fell silent, their eyes flickering with suspicion. Poirot's gaze swept over them, taking in the body language and the subtle cues. Lady Ashford's clenched hands, Sterling's stiff posture, and Firth's rapid breathing. "Ah, Madame, Monsieur, Doctor." Poirot began with a nod, his voice calm but commanding. "I trust you have not forgotten our little meeting." "We were just discussing the case," Lady Ashford said quickly, but Poirot could see the lie in her eyes. The words were too rehearsed, too careful. Poirot smiled faintly. "I hope you are not discussing it too loudly." "We would not want anyone else to hear things they should not." The mention of eavesdropping made the group uncomfortable, and they shifted nervously. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, his eyes flicking from one to the other, keenly aware of every movement, every word. "Miss Worthington is missing, is she not?" Poirot continued, letting the weight of the statement settle in. "A young woman, quite intelligent, and yet she vanishes without a trace. Is that not peculiar?" Dr. Firth cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Lady Ashford. We don't know what happened to her. She was an odd woman, always looking for something, answers to questions no one else seemed to care about." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Answers to questions? What kind of questions?" Firth hesitated before replying. "I believe she was trying to make sense of something, but we all know that some things are better left undisturbed." "Ah," Poirot interjected, stepping closer. "And what might those things be, I wonder?" Sterling suddenly spoke, his voice sharp. "We're all tired, Poirot. You've been asking us questions all night. Can't we just leave it until we're at our destination?" Poirot didn't move, his gaze unflinching. "No, Monsieur Sterling. We cannot simply wait. There are questions that must be answered, and time, I'm afraid, is not on our side." Lady Ashford shifted nervously and looked down at her hands, clearly avoiding Poirot's gaze. He noted her discomfort, but said nothing. Instead, he focused on the group's tension, sensing the walls closing in on them. "Very well," Poirot said, taking a step back. "I believe I have enough to continue my investigation. But before I leave you all to your thoughts, I must ask one final question. Who among you is hiding something? Who among you has secrets they wish to keep buried?" There was a long pause, and for a moment no one spoke. Poirot's eyes lingered on each of them, one by one. He could almost feel the weight of their guilt pressing down on him. "You all know the truth, but none of you are willing to say it," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying an almost hypnotic quality. "But I will uncover it. I always do." The group remained silent as Poirot turned and walked away, leaving them to ponder his words. He knew they were all hiding something, but who was the mastermind? Who was the one pulling the strings? Miss Worthington's disappearance had been orchestrated, but by whom? Poirot made his way to the rear of the train, where the rear carriage door lay in silence. The clue he had been waiting for, something subtle, something hidden, had come to him in a flash. He had seen it earlier, in a place no one else had thought to look. When he reached the rear compartment, Poirot examined it carefully. He found what he was searching for beneath the carpet, a small discarded scrap of paper. It was torn and crumpled, but still legible. His eyes scanned the contents. "I'm being watched. They know I know the truth. If anything happens to me, look to the man in the black suit." Poirot's pulse quickened as the realization hit him. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, the hidden clue that would unravel everything. The man in the black suit. He knew exactly who that was. And now, the pieces were falling into place. With the hidden clue in hand, Poirot's thoughts raced. He had the key to the puzzle, but it would require his unparalleled skills to piece it all together. Time was running out, and the final revelation was closer than ever. Chapter number 7. Unmasking the Puppet Master. The Orient Express was nearing its final destination, but the atmosphere inside the train felt as though it was still caught in the tension of an unresolved climax. The rhythmic hum of the train seemed almost too loud now, each click of the wheels underscoring the urgency in Hercule Poirot's mind. He had the missing piece, the clue that would lead him to the one responsible. But now he needed to act. The time for subtlety had passed. The game was over, and Poirot was prepared to reveal everything. The man in the black suit. Poirot's mind swirled as he recalled all the passengers, the interviews, the contradictions, the small gestures, the subtle hints. The man in the black suit had been right in front of him all along, hiding in plain sight. Poirot had spent hours watching, listening, and quietly assembling the puzzle. He had pieced together each fragment of information like a masterful sculptor revealing the form hidden within a block of stone. But now, he could see the truth, and it was time to reveal it to the others. He moved swiftly through the corridors, the clue still clenched tightly in his hand. As he reached the dining car, he paused, letting his eyes flicker over each of the passengers. They had been waiting for him to act, but they had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that their carefully crafted facades were about to crumble. Poirot cleared his throat and addressed the gathered group, his voice calm yet commanding, a subtle power in his words. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, drawing their attention, "it is time for the truth to be known. All of you have been hiding something, some of you more than others. But today, I shall reveal the entire mystery." The group shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances as they waited for Poirot to continue. Lady Ashford's eyes darted nervously. Geoffrey Sterling's jaw tightened. "Doctor." Firth's hand twitched, but they said nothing. Poirot moved to the center of the room, his small but intense figure commanding the attention of all present. "You all know that Miss Eliza Worthington is missing, yes? But what you do not know is why. I know who is responsible for her disappearance and for the murder that started it all." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room held its breath. "The man in the black suit," Poirot continued, his voice gaining strength, "has been hiding in plain sight. He has been with us the entire time, pretending to be one of you. But he is not. He is the one who holds the key to this entire mystery." At this, the group grew visibly agitated, their nervousness now evident. They had not anticipated Poirot's accusation, especially not one so direct. Poirot's gaze fell on the man standing near the window, looking out at the distant horizon. He was tall, impeccably groomed, and his attire, a black suit, dark tie, and polished shoes, gave him an air of dignified aloofness. This was the man Poirot had been observing since the beginning. Gaston Dupré, the retired diplomat from France. Dupré's face, usually calm and composed, flickered with a brief flash of panic, but it was gone before anyone could notice. He slowly turned to face Poirot, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "Monsieur Dupré," Poirot said, his voice cold with certainty, "you have been playing a dangerous game." But it is over now. Dupré's eyes narrowed, but his posture remained rigid. "I do not know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I have been nothing but a humble traveler on this fine train." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, monsieur. You have been hiding the truth from all of us. You have been involved in something far more sinister than any of us could have imagined. The murder of the man in compartment 6 was not a random act. It was calculated. And you, Monsieur Dupré, have been pulling the strings." Dupré's face turned ashen, but he didn't speak. Poirot continued, his voice growing sharper. You see, I've been watching you. I know about your past, your connections, your fall from grace. You were once a man of power, a diplomat, but now you have become someone desperate. Desperate enough to kill, to hide, and to deceive. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Dupre's lips quivered, but still he did not speak. Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locked on Dupre's. The man in compartment 6 was blackmailing you. He had discovered your secrets. He was going to expose you, and you could not allow that, so you killed him. But then you made a mistake. When Miss Worthington came too close to the truth, you had her removed. You knew she would find out everything, but you didn't account for me. Dupre's face twisted with frustration, but his mouth remained shut. Poirot glanced around the room at the others. Do not think I did not notice your reactions. Miss Worthington had the key all along, but she was too clever for her own good. She was on the verge of uncovering your past, Monsieur Dupre, but you could not afford to let her succeed. And so, you made sure she vanished. Dupre's hands clenched, and for the first time, Poirot saw the man's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. The truth was coming for him, and he knew it. Poirot turned to face the group. And now, the truth is laid bare. The one who held all the cards, the one who manipulated every person aboard this train, is none other than Monsieur Dupre. The room was filled with gasps of shock, and even Dupre, now visibly shaken, could no longer deny the weight of Poirot's words. He slowly sank into a chair, his face pale and drawn. Poirot stood tall, his voice final and resolute. Monsieur Dupre, you are under arrest for the murder of the man in compartment 6 and the disappearance of Miss Worthington. Your secrets are no longer safe. The truth has come to light. As the officers arrived to take Dupre into custody, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The case had been solved, not through physical evidence, but through the subtle art of deduction. Poirot turned to the others, his voice soft yet firm. Remember this. In every lie, there is a sliver of truth, and in every deception, there is a clue waiting to be discovered. All it takes is the will to see it. With that, Poirot stepped away, his task complete. The game was over, and the Orient Express would continue on its journey, its passengers forever chained by the revelations of that fateful night. Chapter number 8. The Last Deception. The tension in the dining car had hardly begun to dissipate before the doors to the compartment opened again, and the two uniformed officers arrived to take Monsieur Dupre into custody. His shoulders slumped, defeated, as he offered no resistance. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, leaving only a man on the brink of ruin, facing the consequences of his own actions. The truth, once buried so carefully beneath layers of manipulation and deceit, had been dragged into the light by Hercule Poirot, and now there was no escaping it. The passengers watched in silence, some with expressions of disbelief, others with the faintest traces of relief, as Dupre was escorted away. The soft murmurs of the crowd gradually grew louder, but Poirot remained still, his gaze lingering on the empty space Dupre had once occupied. He had not yet spoken to the others, but they were already beginning to process what had occurred, the realization that the murderer was no longer amongst them sinking in slowly. Their eyes followed Poirot as he moved toward the front of the room, his small but confident frame standing at the center of it all. The moment of revelation had passed, but there was still work to be done. The case, in its complexity, had demanded Poirot's every ounce of attention and reasoning. Every piece had fallen into place, but in the wake of the storm, the detective knew there were still questions to be answered. Turning back to the passengers who remained, Poirot addressed them once more, his voice steady and composed. It is over, my friends. The mystery of the murder aboard this train has been solved, and the person responsible for both the death of the unfortunate victim and the disappearance of Miss Worthington is no longer a threat. The room seemed to breathe as one collective sigh of relief. Lady Ashford, whose earlier anxiety had been palpable, now appeared to be recovering, though her hands still trembled slightly in her lap. Sterling, his posture relaxed for the first time in hours, exchanged a brief glance with Doctor. Firth, though neither of them spoke. The weight of the moment hung heavy, as if the tension from the past hours had been released all at once, and they were only just beginning to understand the true depth of their involvement in the events. Poirot looked over them all, his sharp eyes narrowing as though he were studying them for the first time. In his methodical way, he had already seen the subtle changes in their expressions, the way the truth affected each of them in different ways. For some, it was the relief of a mystery solved, a life about to return to normal. For others, it was the deep and unsettling awareness of their proximity to death and deceit, their part in something much darker than they had realized. "I trust you all understand now," Poirot continued, his voice quiet but commanding. "The truth is often simpler than we wish it to be. Monsieur Dupré believed that by controlling the narrative, by hiding his past, he could manipulate the lives of those around him. But in the end, it was not his power that held sway. It was his fear of being exposed." His eyes lingered on each of the passengers once more. Fear can drive people to do things they would never otherwise consider. It is a powerful emotion, one that clouds reason, one that pushes them to deceive and lie, even when the truth would set them free. Monsieur Dupré had everything, and yet he was driven by the fear that everything would be taken from him. In his mind, the only way to keep his secret safe was through murder. There was a long silence in the room. Lady Ashford shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers twitching slightly. She caught Poirot's eye, and for the briefest moment their gazes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She had known Dupré, she had known the power he wielded. And now, as the last vestiges of his influence were stripped away, she was left with only the shadows of their past together. "The truth," Poirot said softly, "is often an uncomfortable thing to confront. For some of you, the revelation may come as a surprise, but for others, you knew, or at least suspected, the truth all along. The question, however, is not whether you knew or not. The question is whether you were willing to act on it." Geoffrey Sterling's lips tightened slightly as Poirot's words cut through the air. He had been quiet since Dupré's arrest, his gaze fixed on the floor as though contemplating something beyond the scope of the current conversation. But now, with Poirot's gaze resting on him, he seemed to snap out of his reverie. "And you, Monsieur Sterling," Poirot continued, addressing him directly, "you too had a role to play in this. You were a man with ambition, with power, but that power can be just as dangerous as the fear that drives it. The key, Monsieur Sterling, is not whether you wield power, but whether you allow it to control you." Sterling's face flushed slightly, his hands tightening into fists. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot watched him for a moment longer before turning away, allowing the silence to settle in once again. "You see," Poirot said, his tone returning to that calm, measured quality, "the mystery was never about a single person. It was about the web of connections that bind us all, the fear, the secrets, the lies. They all swirl together, creating a story that becomes more complicated with each passing moment. But in the end, the truth always finds a way to emerge." He paused, his eyes scanning the room once more, taking in the reactions of each of the passengers. It was almost time for him to depart. He had done what he had set out to do, and the case was now closed. But as he looked at them, he saw something more, something that was perhaps even more revealing than the truth of the murder. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, and then he nodded to himself, as if confirming a thought. "Now, I will take my leave," Poirot said, his voice carrying the faintest hint of finality. "The mystery is resolved, and I have done what I was called to do. But remember this, my friends, No one escapes the consequences of their actions. Not forever. With that, Poirot turned and made his way back to his compartment, the soft shuffle of his footsteps the only sound in the otherwise quiet car. The passengers remained where they were, the weight of the truth still hanging over them. Poirot sat down in his seat, his mind already moving on to the next puzzle. The train had one more destination to reach, but for now, the case was closed, and as the Orient Express continued on its journey, Poirot settled into the quiet comfort of knowing that once again, his little grey cells had triumphed. Chapter 9. The Outcome and Justice. As the Orient Express rumbled forward through the night, the rhythm of its wheels beneath the train seemed to settle the final nerves of those aboard. The mystery was solved, the murderer unmasked, and the unsettling sense of danger that had lingered among the passengers had slowly begun to recede, replaced by an uneasy calm. Hercule Poirot, in his compartment, sat with his hands folded neatly before him, his gaze fixed on the window. He had solved the case, as he always did, but there was no triumph in his expression. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a task completed, the necessary order restored, and the truth laid bare for all to see. The train moved ever onward, slicing through the dark expanse of the countryside, and with it, Poirot's thoughts drifted, like the night itself, toward more philosophical matters. Has justice truly been served? Did Dupre's arrest, his confession, offer the resolution that was truly deserved? The passengers would likely go on with their lives, albeit changed, haunted by the events of the past few days. The knowledge that their own fears had somehow intertwined with murder, their involvement, whether direct or indirect, would not easily leave them. And yet Poirot knew the truth. Justice, however cold and impartial, was not a one-size-fits-all resolution. It was a process, not a conclusion. The train's loud whistle broke the silence, signaling the approach of the next station. Poirot knew that once the train reached Calais, the case would officially end. Monsieur Dupre would be handed over to the proper authorities, his fate sealed by the hand of law. But there was one final thing that Poirot needed to do, one last piece to address before his departure. Poirot stood and moved with purpose down the narrow corridor of the train. As he passed through each compartment, he briefly glanced in on the remaining passengers. They had all been left to contemplate their roles in the events, some lost in thought, others quietly discussing the moments of revelation. Lady Ashford caught his gaze as he passed, and for the first time since the beginning of the investigation, there was no fear in her eyes, only a faint understanding, a shared moment of clarity between the two of them. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging his silent yet immense contribution to unraveling the mystery. Geoffrey Sterling, his earlier haughtiness stripped away, sat with his back against the seat, looking out the window as though lost in deep thought. He had been closest to Dupré in the game, though he never quite fully understood the rules. Now, his own world would need to adjust to the revelation, his ambitions likely thwarted by the unforeseen consequences of his involvement. Dr. Firth, whose nerves had frayed more than anyone else's throughout the investigation, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Yet, as Poirot watched him, he saw the remnants of something else, a lingering guilt, perhaps. Firth had been caught in the tangle of lies, and now he would have to reckon with his conscience. Poirot finally made his way back to his compartment, where he found the train slowing, its destination nearly upon them. He stood at the window for a moment, gazing out at the rising dawn, the pale blue light filtering over the tracks, signaling the end of the journey. But even as the train approached Calais, Poirot's mind remained sharp. The answers had come, but the process of untangling the human heart, the motives, the fears, the drives that led one person to harm another, was never so easily finished. He was reminded of the words he often repeated to others. It is not the facts that are important, but the behavior behind them. The truth it hides in what is not said, in the things that people cannot or will not reveal. The door to his compartment opened, and the young maid from earlier entered, her face a mask of quiet relief. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice filled with gratitude, "I wanted to thank you. For everything. You've saved us all." Poirot smiled, his expression softening for the first time in what felt like ages. "No, mademoiselle, it is not I who should be thanked. It is you. Without your courage, none of this would have been possible." The maid's face lit up, though she looked as though she might burst into tears at any moment. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot nodded and gave her a slight bow. "You're welcome, mademoiselle. But remember, one must always have the courage to speak the truth, no matter how difficult it may seem." As the maid exited, Poirot allowed himself a final moment of reflection. The case had closed, and Dupré was on his way to the authorities. The passengers would soon disembark in Calais, return to their lives, their roles in the story now concluded. And yet, Poirot knew in his heart that the true resolution was always more complex than what any official report could capture. The shadows of the past always followed a person, no matter how far they traveled. But that, Poirot knew, was what made his work so important. His ability to peel back the layers, to uncover the hidden truths, and to restore balance to a world that often seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. With the train now fully slowed, Poirot straightened his jacket and stepped out into the aisle, ready to disembark. As he did, he turned to face the passengers one last time. The train had reached its destination, and so had the case. Justice had been served, and the truth had been revealed. But for Hercule Poirot, there would always be another case, another puzzle waiting to be solved. The world was full of mysteries, and for as long as he lived, Poirot would remain its most dedicated and astute observer. With a final glance toward the passengers and the morning sun rising over the French countryside, Poirot left the Orient Express, the mystery solved, the truth revealed, and his mind already turning toward the next challenge.